Hello there, my name is Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. In a recent video, I shared some estate sale finds. Today, I'm going to use the layer cakes I made from some estate sale fabric. I really love doing chevron patterns. I also really like the way brown and white look together. And as usual, my plan starts on a scratch sheet of paper. The first thing I did was count these brown 10-inch squares that I had cut, and I wanted to make sure I had enough for my plan. I will leave all the exact needs for my plan in the description. Well, it turned out of the 5 yards of this fabric, I had enough to make 2 quilts out of my plan. Chevron making is not too hard once you understand how it works. All we need to do is make some half square triangles. On my white 10-inch squares, I'm going to draw a line diagonally across the square from corner to corner. If you're using fabric with a right and a wrong side, make sure and draw your line on the wrong side of the fabric. To get ready to chain piece my half square triangles, I took a brown 10-inch square, placed it right sides together with my white 10-inch square, and just stacked them up. Let's get started with this chain piecing. I'm placing a brown 10-inch square right sides together with my white 10-inch square so I can see the line. I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the line. Once I chain pieced all of them on one side, I separated all the units, then I stitched a 1/4 inch seam down the other side of the line that I had drawn. Now these diagonal lines were a lot bigger than I'm usually cutting, so I got out my rotary cutter and a ruler to cut on the line that I had drawn and separate these into 2 half square triangles. Once I had all those half square triangles separated, I pressed them all open to the darker side. Now it was time to trim. Now, if you cut perfect 10-inch squares and you stitched perfect 1/4 inch seams, you would trim these half square triangles to 9.5 inches. And if you had stitched perfectly, you wouldn't even have to trim them. They would be perfect. Well, what I'm doing in my case, I'm not perfect. I'm trimming my half square triangles down to 9.25 inches. That is because some of my seams were a little wonky, some of my cuts were a little off. I'm not worried about that. I just want to get a nice quilt top done to give away to some little kid. Well, here is a look for you of the aftermath of trimming my squares. Now let's talk about these 10-inch brown squares. When I cut up my estate sale finds, had I known then that I was not going to need to cut all of this up, I wouldn't have, but I did. So now my question is, how do I stitch this together? Do I want to trim these 10-inch squares to 9 1/4 so they match the other half square triangle blocks? My answer to that is no. I am going to stitch together 6 10-inch squares, and the reason I am not trimming them is because I want to have as much useful leftover fabric as possible. If I'm going to trim off 3/4 of an inch for each side, that's going to go in the trash. There's really nothing I can do with it, but by sewing the 10-inch squares together, I'll have a little overlap off of the end of each row, and I'll be able to use that in a future project instead of putting it in the trash. My first step in assembling this quilt top is to build my chevron rows. So I'm moving my little sewing machine a little bit farther back. What I'm going to be doing is doing one row where the white half square triangle forms the peak, and then right below that will be 2 squares where the brown forms the peak. To make sure I didn't have any mistakes while I was stitching these together, see what I'm doing here? I'm using all my half square triangles, laying them out one at a time in each of these piles so I make sure I get the right number of units with the right peak. Now I'm going to work my way through these stacks, stitching 2 units together to form either a white peak or a brown peak. Once I got through round 1 on the white peaks, I picked up the pieces for the brown peaks and started putting them together in the exact same way. Once I finished with the brown peaks, I continued chaining the solid 10-inch squares together. Now, if you were planning this quilt out in advance, you wouldn't have to do this part. You would just cut the right size fabric for your row. Now for round 2, I'm sewing 2 of the white peak units together. I'm separating the thread, and then I am sewing on that 3rd unit to make my entire row. I did the same thing with all my brown peak units. Here you can see I've got a light peak chevron row complete, and I'm matching it up with a dark peak chevron row. You can see how that brown fabric kind of just goes up and down. When I'm putting 2 rows together, I put them right sides together, and I usually put a clip or a pin or something to hold that together right on the seam where 2 blocks come together. Now don't limit yourself to 2 colors of chevron quilts. These can be made multicolor, they can be made 2-tone, they can be made holiday, just so many options with a chevron pattern. Smaller chevrons could also be used as a quilt border. Well, my quilt plan has 2 chevron groups separated by 3 plain fabrics. So I'm getting these chevron rows stitched together. Then I'm going to complete those solid rows and build my quilt. What I was trying to decide here was, did I want my chevron dark points pointing at each other from the two separate sections? And I decided I did. So now it's just a matter of matching up a solid row with a chevron row, another solid row with another chevron row, and then putting everything together with that last solid row. Now you probably noticed I'm not using a lot of clips right now. However, when it came time to put the two big sections together to finalize the quilt, I definitely used clips. When it gets so big and so bulky, it gets a little bit hard to keep it together, and it's easier to just put clips in at the start than to fiddle with it later. Now you can see that little tail of excess fabric. We're going to trim that excess fabric off of all these rows. I made sure that excess was all on the same side of the quilt to make it a little easier on myself. So I'm just lining it up with my ruler, lining my ruler up with the chevron row, and trimming off that excess fabric. And you can see now I have quite a nice little piece of scrap here to work with, rather than throwing the 1/4 inch here, 1/4 inch there in the trash. I've got a nice big piece to work with. Well, here is the finished quilt top. I really love the simplicity of the chevron pattern bordered by the solid rows. And as I mentioned, I had enough for 2 complete quilt tops. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you coming along with me. Hope you had fun. I hope to see you back again real soon.